I'm Inez Stepman,
I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
and this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, so we have a great lineup of topics for you today, and a lot of them have to do with Doge. First, we're going to talk about the argument that we've been hearing from the left about election and who elected, quote unquote, Elon Musk. So Amber is going to talk us through that. Then we're going to move to federal judges and the role, the federal sort of response from the judiciary. And Ben is going to talk us through that. And then I'm going to talk about something somewhat related. Where I'm going to talk about the arguments that former Treasury secretaries have made in the New York Times, also related to Doge and access and about the civil service. And then finally, we're going to move outside of the United States. We're going to talk about the end of the Gaza ceasefire, the hostage negotiations, and the way that Trump has sort of flipped the table over as he has wanted to do and reset the board for a different game. So that's our lineup and for you this week. And with that, I'm going to kick it over to Amber to start us off.
Thank you, Inez. Yeah, so I will stick more to the political and rhetorical arguments against Doge and Elon Musk. Before we get into the legal stuff, I will reserve that for the experts. But there's been this sort of resounding cry from the left, including columnists in the Washington Post and New York Times and all over X and I guess Blue Sky, if you follow that sort of thing. I know I don't, but unfortunately, we sort of have to see their posts from time to time just to know what the left is saying. But they've been saying, well, Elon Musk, nobody elected Elon Musk. Nobody elected Doge to come in and look at the Treasury payment system or to go through USAID or whatever other areas of government waste he's been flagging for the president. And I mean, first of all, on its face, the argument's pretty stupid because Elon Musk was very prominent on the campaign trail with Donald Trump. He first appeared at that rally in Pennsylvania, the return to Butler. He continued to attend rallies after that. He was at Capital One the night that Trump was inaugurated. He was at all the balls with the Trump family. He dumped like $400 million into the Trump reelection campaign. And Through America PAC was a huge part of the grassroots ground game for the Trump campaign. So it was no secret that Elon Musk was going to be a part of this effort. Doge was announced pretty early on, from what I can remember, if not shortly after the election, then before the election. This was not some like well-kept secret from the American people. Trump went to the rocket launch. He talked constantly on the campaign trail about how much he loved the fact that Elon was able to catch this rocket as it came back down to Earth. So that makes zero sense. And even the left at the time was talking about Elon Musk's presence on the Trump campaign and how concerning it was and how this was a billionaire basically buying Trump. Another billionaire makes no sense. But that argument on space is farcical. But then when you get into some of the specific allegations about the Treasury payment system, for example, there was a lot of fear mongering over Elon Musk has your social security number. Why does he have access to that? We didn't elect him to be able to look at our private financial information. And I wrote an op-ed about this for the Daily Caller. And I think this headline pretty much sums it up, which is Elon Musk has your social security number. Well, so do tons of unelected bureaucrats. I mean, if you just go through the different departments within the government that probably have your social security number, and all of the unelected bureaucrats who work there can access it for any myriad of reasons. Like, sure, there's technically privacy boundaries related to that, but nonetheless, I don't think any of us really believe that all of these bureaucrats are abiding by those in the first place, but they can still see it for a number of different reasons. I mean, if you took out student loans, the Department of Education has all of your financial information. The IRS has all of your information because they are the ones collecting your taxes. You're filing your tax returns with them. The Treasury Department's Bureau of the Fiscal Service is responsible for doling out your tax refunds. So they have all of your financial data. And of course, the Social Security Administration, which literally gave you your Social Security number. And if you're receiving Social Security payments, They probably have even more of your financial information. So we're talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of unelected bureaucrats who have had access to this in the entirety of the modern federal government and federal bureaucracy. This is not unique to Elon Musk or the three guys in Doge who apparently only have read-only access and only had read-only access since the beginning of their efforts to the Treasury payment system. And on top of that, Katie Miller, who's the spokesperson for Doge, as well as independent reporting from the New York Times and CNN, have all confirmed that everyone who's involved in this has the proper background checks, security clearances to be able to access this data the same way that any of those other unelected bureaucrats would. So this is sort of a desperate cry from the left, I think, to try to turn around the anti-bureaucracy arguments on Trump. But in the grand scheme of things, you're talking about, what, 5 people who have been confirmed members of Doge compared to the entirety of the federal government. The scale of it alone is indicative of the fact that Trump is really running full speed ahead in cutting down the size of government, waste, fraud, and abuse, getting some of these employees out who have either been lazy, derelict in their duty, or actively trying to go against the executive's political priorities policy-wise. And not to mention the fact that there have been so many government data breaches over the past 2-3 decades that not only do these unelected bureaucrats have your data, but so do all kinds of bad actors, most notably China, which hacks the Treasury pretty much every single year, according to statements that they've put out. There was a big one at the end of December of this past year where they announced that Chinese hackers stole documents related to financial sanctions and had targeted heads of departments and other officials within the federal bureaucracy to steal their data. And the GAO has had major data leaks. So this is, again, not like this lockdown place where your data is stored and nobody can access it. It is available to all kinds of people, including malicious people. Not to mention the fact that the president has the right to bring in his people to execute his vision. There's nothing abnormal about that. The idea that it has to be Trump himself going in to look at the financial payment systems of the Treasury and not the people that he hires is just ridiculous. But I'll open it up to the group to talk a little bit more about this argument and kind of where it leads us. But I just find this to be sort of the cry of a party that has no way to combat the speed at which Trump is enacting his vision, the flood the zone strategy, and they're sort of just grasping at straws, plastic ones now, not paper ones, because Trump signed that executive order this week. But it's quite fantastic to watch.
Yeah, I think if you flip this argument around, it becomes immediately obvious how absurd it is. And that is, who has authority to review the payments and the decisions made by unelected bureaucrats in the Treasury? And if you ask that simple question, who has the authority over that, it's very clear that it has to be the president. And then the next logical step is the thing that Amber pointed to, which is he has to bring in his people. That's an absurd idea that the president would individually review every single line item of spending in the executive branch. So obviously his people have to have access. He's chosen Elon Musk and the handful of guys working with him at Doge to review this spending. And I think, again, it's worth delineating the lines of authority here, because I think they're being intentionally muddied and conflated. It is ultimately Donald Trump's decision as head of the executive branch and elected president what programs are paused, what programs are stopped, what program, all of the substance of these decisions. Ultimately, those lines of authority run through Donald Trump. In this case, Elon Musk is merely his agent, his employee, right? And so I think there's this deliberate attempt to confuse that because, of course, when you lay bare what Amber just did, the answer that they have to give to that question of who has authority to review the decisions of unelected bureaucrats in the Treasury the answer they have to give is no one, right? If the political appointees of the president don't have that power, the answer they have to give is no one. And that's how they like it. That is, in fact, the answer that they've been giving for the last 30 years. But it's not an answer that I think is being accepted by the American people. And that's why we have this intentional conflation and fear mongering about, oh, we didn't elect Elon Musk to run the government. What's he poking his nose in? He's acting as a direct agent for Trump. If Trump tomorrow didn't want Elon Musk poking around in the government, he would lose access, right? So I think it's an intentional kind of red herring to get out of answering the question, who reviews and ultimately decides, the work of these bureaucrats. And the answer that both the left and frankly, the captured opposition of the Republican Party have given for more than 3 decades is no one.
Yeah. Really, really quickly here. I will absolutely take no lectures from the Democrats on unelected bureaucrats running the country. They had a senile president they propped up. The entire government had been run by these bureaucrats. There wasn't even a real president. It's not clear what decisions were actually made by him, especially towards the end of his administration. Second, the idea that this wasn't what people voted for. Elon campaigned with Trump repeatedly. Trump repeatedly promised to put sick Elon on the bureaucracy. There might be some case for this argument in a world where none of this plan was put forward, but the idea of Elon running Doge was a serious part of the Elon endorsement and what both of them were talking about on the campaign trail. So it's just a reach. I think the ultimate reason for this is to try and create a wedge between Elon and Trump, which is, I think, honestly, the left's number one objective.
Yeah, and you've seen that neither Elon nor Trump are going to take the bait, so that has failed to date. And I think ultimately this is really a dodge about Doge, which is to say that the issue of privacy matters, for example, or God forbid, these individuals who are serving as the president's agents are going to go into the agencies and actually look at what the agencies have been doing. I think it's going to totally backfire on the left, the savaging and attacking of Doge. And I think it's ultimately going to come out really popular when you look at the favorability ratings that will show up in the polls. You need people from outside the system to be the ones probing the system. The last people who you would ever want doing the kind of forensic analysis that people who actually know how to code are doing right now are those who come from the system. So this is a shock to the status quo. And the fear among the administrative staters, the Democrats, and the regime media mouthpieces, all it suggests is that Doge is actually being effective in exposing the waste, fraud, abuse, rot, and corruption that lies within. And that is really what they're terrified about. The left and the regime is terrified that their rot and corruption is going to be exposed and that the gravy train is ultimately going to end. And that's why they feel they need to destroy Doge. But I don't think they do it. And the more they attack, the more they're going to validate Doge's work.
And we're just going to really continue this discussion with more specificity about the Treasury Department and about the objections to Doge, because I think one level of these objections has been the rhetoric that we were just talking about with Amber Stepman, which is the nobody elected Elon Musk. But there are 2 other prongs to this assault, and the first, I guess the second one that I'm going to discuss is a series of quote unquote constitutional arguments for the most part, and then Ben is finally gonna talk about a lot of the sort of the judicial potential limitations or stoppages of some of the Trump EOs, including Doge, but not limited to it. So in terms of the arguments here about, again, authority and constitutional separation of powers, there was I think, really important op-ed to read by 5 former Treasury secretaries, right? Very familiar setup, just 41 defense intelligence officials, or there's this sort of setup of people who had been in charge during the uniparty years, writing overwrought sort of rhetorical warnings to all of us. This one is no different. The headline is 5 former Treasury secretaries, Our Democracy is Under Siege. And this is published in the New York Times on Monday. But I think it is important to address some of the arguments that they've made here. So once again, the premise of this is that Doge's access to treasury payments, even if it's view only, is some kind of quote unquote assault on democracy because they're acting from outside of the established bureaucratic system. And I just want to take this opportunity to show how backwards that argument is. And I wanted to read one part of it that I specifically wanted to respond to, which is the nation's payment system has historically been operated by a very small group of nonpartisan career civil servants. In recent days, that norm has been upended, and the roles of these nonpartisan officials have been compromised by political actors from the so-called Department of Government Efficiency. These political actors have not been subject to the same rigorous ethics rules as civil servants, and one has explicitly retained his role in a private company. They lack the training and expertise to handle personal private data like social security numbers and bank account information. Okay, so again, the premise here is that it is illegitimate for the president, because ultimately the president is the one hiring Elon Musk to do this job. It is illegitimate for the president to review the payments that are going out. That is the province of quote unquote career apolitical bureaucrats, right, in the civil service, because those bureaucrats have certain protections. Now, of course, everything Amber said in the last segment applies here. It's not like these career bureaucrats have not caused a number of like important leaks, right, even to America's enemies. So just on terms of competency, this is an absurd argument. But I think the far more sort of pernicious underlying agenda here is to say, yes, there is a large part, whether it's treasury payments, but you can expand this to just about any department, right? There is a large part of the function of American government that ought to be insulated from quote unquote political actors. Well, what does that mean when you're talking about political actors? You're talking about the people we elected, right? That there's an illegitimacy to politics, quote unquote, interfering with the work of the American government. Well, we call that interference democracy. So again, you see over and over again that the kind of arguments that have to be made to defend the quote unquote norm of American government for the last 3 years, 30 years, or really going back, in this case, you're going back 60, 70 years to the expansion of some of these bureaucracies under Nixon and before that, the progressive era. But it's true that has been a quote unquote norm, a norm that has solidified and ossified in the last 30 years. It isn't constitutional. And now the left finds themselves in this very, I would say, uncomfortable position of trying to constitutionally justify the way that American government has been operating and finding that they really have to reach at straws to do so. And I think pulling apart that absurd language is really worth seeing. Basically saying we can't have political interference in the government. That is the argument of a tyrant. We can't have political interference in our democratically elected government. That is what political interference means. So again, I think it's important to draw clear lines of accountability. Every time one of these arguments pops up from the left, I think tracing the lines of accountability and when those lines of accountability do not ultimately end in an election somewhere, there, is a piece of our government that has been operating without democratic oversight, possibly for decades. So I don't know what you guys think about this op-ed. I think this has been, this is probably only the first salvo. This smells to me like the frame they're going to use going forward. And that's why you have these 5 prominent cabinet secretaries, right? Robert Rubin, Lawrence Summer, Timothy Geithner, Jacob Lew, and Janet Yellen all co-signing on this op-ed that is essentially an argument for an unaccountable bureaucratic state. So I don't know what you guys like. How successful do you think that this argument is going to be? And how difficult do you think it is going to be to break this up? Because we are going to see, we're going to see the swamp fight back. We're going to see sort of professional DC fight back. And despite the successes of the last 3 weeks, there is a lot of law on their side in some of these cases, especially about civil service protections and elsewhere. And so how difficult do you think it's going to be to cut through all of these things that are ultimately unconstitutional and anti-democratic?
Yeah, I think
Let
they
me
will
just
not succeed. Oh, sorry. Okay,
No,
I'll
go
go
for
ahead. Okay. Yeah, I think they will not succeed. I think it is a new era. the Trump administration is not going to let them succeed, and there's no way these arguments would ultimately prevail in the Supreme Court. I know Ben's about to talk about the court cases, but these arguments are not going to prevail in the Supreme Court. I think it's time we put an end to this notion of the nonpartisan civil service. They obviously have a political bent. Look at their donations. But, it's briefly, I'll talk about, one of the things today in Israel. I'm actually at the King David Hotel right now in Jerusalem, and we're meeting people in Israel. And one of the big topics of today that we listened to some lectures was about the judicial reform in Israel. And we listened to a liberal law professor try and defend the existing Israeli judicial system. And right from the get-go, she's like, we need to protect the democratic character of Israel, and the judicial reform would wrongly politicize the judiciary in Israel. And it's like the complete lack of understanding that democracy and politics are synonyms. Things that are politicizing something are increasing the amount of democratic input and accountability. But it's like something about the liberal mind does not think that democracy and politics are synonyms, but rather that democracy with all its positive valence is only synonymous with liberalism. And I think that's what's going on here.
Yeah, they've completely perverted the meaning of democracy. And that's one of the reasons why I think this ultimately fails, at least in public discourse and among the American people. We'll see ultimately in terms of the legislative branch and the judiciary and how it all shakes out in the political sphere. But outside of the political sphere, with the people who are supposed to control that political sphere, I think there has to be a sentiment among the American people at this point that there they go again, using democracy again to mean the total opposite of democracy, really meaning ruling class tyranny. And the notion that it's an assault on democracy to actually impose transparency and accountability based upon delegates, essentially, of the American people. The reality is the administrative state is an assault on democracy. When you have unaccountable, unelected bureaucrats who are the ones making law, implementing the law, thwarting the will of everyone else, that is tyranny defined. And of course, as we know, the administrative state itself has the powers of the executive, legislative, and judiciary branches when you consider that, of course, there are administrative law courts themselves. So obviously, this is a rhetorical effort to try and put some kind of veneer of democratic legitimacy on something that is not at all a Democrat or legitimate. But I think the reason you're seeing this fight break out and manifesting itself in so many different realms, including in the public discourse, again, is because for the first time in our lifetimes, clearly, the administrative state and all of its defenders and all of the people who have a vested interest in maintaining this status quo actually think that it might be under threat. And that's why you're going to see the hysteria, the outrage, the rhetoric, and then, of course, the lawfare aspect that I'll talk about next. But I think all of this illustrates that we have found their weak spot, and they feel threatened in the way they've never felt threatened before. Consequently, they're going to lash out like they've never lashed out before. But I think among the American people, our side of the argument is winning like never before, really, since the instantiation of the administrative state.
And I'll just add briefly here that to tie these two segments together on both the political arguments against what Musk and Trump are doing and the judicial activism in the attempt to stop it, is that the CBS YouGov poll that came out this week showed that 70% of Americans believe that Trump is doing what he promised on the campaign. So there's no legitimate argument that this is not what the American people democratically chose to happen in the federal government.
And with that, we'll just kick it right back to Ben to continue the discussion about the lawfare piece of this.
Sure. So I think by some counts, there are at least 40 lawsuits or so pertaining to Trump administration actions ranging across a whole slew of areas. And recently, J.D. Vance himself shot back at some of the judges who have been presiding over these cases and essentially trying to thwart the administration. And he said a line which I think really characterizes well the insanity of what we're seeing unfold. He said, and he tweeted, "If a judge tried to tell a general how to conduct a military operation, that would be illegal. If a judge tried to command the attorney general in how to use her discretion as a prosecutor, that's also illegal. Judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power." And that is the bottom line of an argument that I think we're going to see play out in the lower courts and very quickly probably work their way up to the Supreme Court in connection with some of the asinine lawfare that's being waged by blue state prosecutors, as well as like-minded, quote-unquote, NGOs, probably some of them that have received government funding if we started to dig into them, as the administration has exposed. One of the absurd cases dealt with that Office of Management and Budget directive, the memo, essentially to faithfully implement the president's executive orders with regard to freezing funding to certain domestic concerns. And there a judge declared unequivocally that Trump must immediately restore frozen funding and must immediately end any federal funding pause. Margot Cleveland, writing about this at The Federalist, noted that the command was all-encompassing, applying to any federal funding pause. It didn't matter why the federal funding was paused, whether the pause was permitted by a grant, a statute, or regulation, or done as part of the internal management and oversight by agencies. And by the plain language of the order, it didn't matter whether the funding went to the plaintiff states or came from one of the defendant agencies. The order represented a complete coup over the executive. And the order, it should be noted, was a temporary restraining order. Why is that significant? Temporary restraining orders typically, and the lawyers here can speak to this, are not appealable. So you have to go through further adjudication before you can even appeal to the freeze that one federal judge in one venue is imposing on the entire executive branch. Unelected judge, of course. The maybe more kind of extreme case that we've sort of been talking around is this New York case brought against Doge and really the Trump administration's Treasury Department, which tries to delineate between those quote unquote nonpartisan career civil servants and the political appointees. And pursuant to another temporary restraining order from Judge Engelmeyer in New York, he decrees that only some civil servants will be able to access Treasury payment systems. Political appointees won't. Trump, the Treasury Department, and Scott Bessent, the incoming Treasury Secretary, were restrained from granting access to any Treasury Department payment record, payment systems, or any other data systems maintained by the Treasury Department other than to civil servants with a need for access to perform their job duties. That's according to Engelmeyer's ruling. Again, not immediately appealable. There are a couple elements that I think are worth focusing on. One is the fact that clearly this was what I think the left feels their best remedy is to gum up the works, sabotage, subvert, drain the resources, the time, the attention of the Trump administration, which is you go right to the most favorable possible venue where you're likeliest to get the most left-wing judge to rubber stamp your gumming up the works of the actual democratic process. And you're going to try to litigate the administration to death in a whole slew of areas where the president takes executive action. This is their first line of defense outside of what they're trying to do in the information space and with the rhetoric. This was really the play during Trump 1 as well. Now, Trump 2, there's 1,000 more different war fronts that the administration has opened up. I'm sure that the administration is girded for these attacks. You've noticed probably that the administration has been pretty disciplined in not speaking out overtly about many of these court cases because they're not ripe yet for the Supreme Court. But I think they're going to quickly end up there. And the point that I think ought to be emphasized again and again, and Justice Clarence Thomas brought this up during Trump 1, particularly in the Trump v. Hawaii case, is that this puts a spotlight on the insanity that one federal judge presiding over one case brought by certain plaintiffs can freeze a policy for everyone everywhere, rather than just ruling on the merits of the individual case and how a policy impacts the specific plaintiffs in the case. And really, this points to the tyranny of universal injunctions, which essentially subordinate every other branch to the judiciary, even though I would argue the notion of co-equal branches is actually a fallacy. And it's really the legislative branch, which created most of these lower courts, by the way, created the courts outside of the Supreme Court, and really that they should be subordinate to the legislative branch, and obviously the executive branch at all. The judiciary's job is to rule on controversies. It is not to overrule a president and to micromanage the individual actions that a president undertakes via the powers granted to it by the legislative branch and the executive power that we see in the Constitution. All of these arguments, I think, are going to come up. But I think what has to happen is the Trump administration has to destroy universal injunctions once and for all before the Supreme Court. And Justice Clarence Thomas in the Trump v. Hawaii case explained that universal injunctions are really without historical precedent. They're legally dubious. They're practically absurd. And he said basically that the court really needs to ultimately rule on this and that the executive branch should make the court's day and push it there. There's going to be an opportunity to do that by this administration. It has to do that. And beyond that fact, and Mike Davis of the Article 3 Project has pointed to this, there also really needs to be judiciary reform. I see today, a couple hours before we started recording this, Eli Crane, a congressman out of Arizona, has filed impeachment papers, is drafting articles of impeachment for Judge Engelmeyer. I think this is the next war we're going to see on the lawfare aspect of things, which is taking on absurd justices who act in tyrannical ways. So with all that, a lot to potentially cover there. Curious what you all think about this tactic and then ultimately how this controversy and confrontation is going to play out between the executive branch and the judiciary.
So on nationwide injunction, I think again, I very much agree with Justice Thomas's argument and dissent that you're summarizing there, Ben, about the at best this should be like a extremely narrowly used tool for the federal judiciary, and the idea that again you can venue shop, find the most liberal judge in the country, and then freeze. This is even more absurd than some of the other ones because you're freezing what the executive is doing within the executive branch. And therefore, I think there's a constitutional argument that comes into play as to whether the judiciary even has jurisdiction over what its co-equal branch does within its own branch of government, right? Directing what the president can and cannot do within the executive branch is even one step more absurd. But I do actually think that's a bit of a, I don't want to say a side issue because it's clearly going to become a practical problem and something that has to be dealt with. But at the end of the day, it doesn't touch the merits of these questions. And I think what we're going to have is a series of essentially landmark decisions out of the Supreme Court where we decide about the constitutionality, again, of the system of the fourth branch of government, of unelected bureaucrats. And again, this is something, it's kind of funny because this is something that's been at Federalist Society conferences for decades, right? It's something that both libertarian conservatives and like the new right have both been concerned about. And it's, you know, it's not a new topic. It's sort of a perennial complaint for conservatives. And now we're going to see whether a lot of these conservative institutions, allegedly conservative institutions, are going to back Donald Trump in actually restoring the Constitution. And again, kicking up some of these really important questions and forcing the Supreme Court to actually address them. I mean, just off the top of my head, right? We're going to be, this touches on separation of powers. It touches on the unitary executive theory and how much power the president will have over his own branch of government, right? There's a delegation problem. Ben noted that this pause, this temporary restraining order does not distinguish between decisions about programs that are appropriated and line item from Congress versus not. I mean, that is an issue at the very heart of this, right? Because again, when you're making the argument that essentially the executive is out of control and that he's usurping the powers of the other branches, you have to make that argument vis-a-vis Congress. And then 9 times out of 10 or more, I mean, I haven't looked at every single one of these programs because there are so many of them that have been paused or examined or retooled, right? But the vast majority of those programs do not have enabling legislation. Or their enabling legislation is at such a level of lack of specificity, at such a level of vagueness, that they could really be reappropriated by the president and the executive branch into anything. Now, the question is, how far apart are those two things, the president and the executive branch? Are we going to legitimate essentially bureaucratic tyranny and say, no, there's an executive branch apart from the political decisions of the president? Ultimately, I don't think the Supreme Court is going to okay that theory. But let's, be serious about this. This is how our government has operated. It is not Bill on the Hill, Capitol, whatever, like the little song from Schoolhouse Rock. It has not been that the legislature passes legislation and then the executive branch executes it by spending that money. What's happened is the legislature is passes something that's so incredibly vague that just turns over enormous power to bureaucrats in each of these departments. And then the bureaucrats are actually effectively writing the law, giving out the grants, and executing these programs. Now, if the president doesn't control those bureaucrats, Congress doesn't control them either because they've given such vague instructions. So if it's neither, the answer is neither of those guys control these bureaucrats, well, then no one does. And we have no accountability and no democratic oversight over those people. So again, I think there's going to have to be a series of Supreme Court rulings on this, essentially on the legitimacy of the fourth branch of government that really began under the progressive era and has just exploded again and again in the 60s and again in the 90s, and now fully weaponized with their own political opinions. As Will intimated earlier, most of the federal employees overall donate about 95% to the Democratic Party, among those who have put in donations that are tracked by the SEC, right? So FEC, but so they have political opinions. Okay, they have the political opinions of a faculty lounge, and the question is, who controls them, if anyone? And those are questions the Supreme Court is ultimately going to have to address.
And just watch how the left is going to talk about those Supreme Court decisions when they come out. It's going to immediately be, the court is conservative, the court is politically biased, they've been handpicked by Donald Trump, they're compromised. And so they're going to try to delegitimize the Supreme Court's opinions after their own judicial activists are the ones who decided to weigh in on this and try to strip the constitutionally appropriated powers of the executive.
Yeah, there's a lot to say on this topic, but I'll try and keep it somewhat brief. I think it is remarkable that all these TROs are coming out, but I think ultimately it is a good thing that the liberals are deciding to fight on such terrible ground, getting all these temporary restraining orders on things that are clearly lawful and would be within the executive's prerogative. I think it means that we're very likely to prevail at the Supreme Court, not just on these particular and beating these injunctions, but actually beating the entire idea of a nationwide injunction. And so I think, this is a case of the left getting greedy with its lawfare. They're not being strategic. They're not picking a smart case that has better facts than the one. Instead, they're basically saying, actually, this terrible Engelmeyer opinion distinguishing between political appointees and career civil servants, the idea that appears anywhere in our Constitution or anywhere in our law is absurd. Anyway, I'll go ahead and move on to my topic, which is Gaza. So if you haven't seen, we are looking at the end potentially of the Gaza ceasefire. On Saturday, 3 hostages were released here in Israel. They looked gaunt. They looked emaciated. They had been very clearly very poorly treated by Hamas, unsurprisingly. But the degree to which it was really dramatic, they looked like Holocaust victims. That led to a lot of anguish in Israel, but it also led to a very interesting interview with President Trump, where he said first, I think a few days ago, something along the lines of, we can't take this anymore. Like they look like Holocaust victims. We're not going to tolerate this for much longer. And then yesterday, I believe, he, in a press conference, basically said, I'm not going to speak for the Israelis, but I'll say this. I think that they should have to release every single hostage on Saturday by noon. And if they don't, we should just unleash hell on them. And paraphrasing now, I'd heard competing reports from the Israeli government, but I just saw on X that apparently Netanyahu is following along somewhat in Trump's line. He said that given the appearance of the hostages that were released last Saturday, that unless Hamas releases all 9 remaining living hostages that were supposed to be released in phase 1 of this hostage deal, that Netanyahu and Israel will go back to war with Hamas. That's the basic facts. I think it's a perfectly reasonable. Honestly, I'm here in Israel and I haven't actually had that many chances to talk in detail about the hostage deals and, sort of the decisions of the Israeli government with people, oddly enough. But one of the things I've thought, especially after listening to podcasts about this, is I think that, Israel has an issue where it is historically has struggled to get fair deals for its hostages. And this goes all the way back to the Gilad Shalit deal, where they gave up over 1,000 Hamas criminals to get one single Israeli soldier out of captivity. And among the, prisoners that Israel released was a guy named Yahya Sinwar, who ultimately launched the October 7th attacks and became the head of Hamas. So I think that, I was a little bit skeptical of the ceasefire deal because it's better than the Shalit deal, but that's not saying much. They were still giving up, not only were they giving up 30 convicted criminals for every one hostage they got out, they were also being willing to train criminals for the remains of dead hostages, which I thought was bizarre. And they were giving up some of their strategic position within Gaza. Not all of it. They've held on to the border, control the border with Egypt, but they've given up control of the border, or of what's called the Netzarim corridor, which is the sort of barrier that they built. Not barrier, but they took control of an area that split the Gaza Strip in half, and really gave them full control of Gaza, and they've given that up. I don't think that's necessarily a good idea. So I think it's actually probably best for the Israeli state to be kind of forced into ending the ceasefire and going back to war, and defeating Hamas, because it's clear they still have plenty of ability to be sovereign in Gaza, given those things. But so that's my view on that. I think, the only thing I'm actually have to say is I was supposed to leave on Monday. So the idea of the war restarting on Saturday is a little bit scary in terms of my ability to get a flight out of Tel Aviv. But that's my selfish reasons talking. I wish Trump would have said something about a deadline on Wednesday of next week.
Yeah, I mean, Israel has a long history, and I think it's wrapped up in the Jewish character of the state. The fact that they are bent over a barrel on hostages. They refuse to allow hostages to be killed. And in fact, they often, as Will intimated, they often even trade away enormous and continuing military advantage for even the bodies, the dead bodies of hostages. And it's hard to sort of criticize that because it is part of the Jewish character and the religious character of the state, I guess, but it is a huge strategic liability. It remains a huge strategic liability for Israel, particularly because they don't have the death penalty either. So one of the other obvious solutions for this is when they have convict terrorist masterminds like Yahya Sinwar to execute them, so they cannot be then traded back. I mean, the Sinwar story is even more ridiculous because the guy was dying of brain cancer. Israeli hospitals saved his life, and then he was released and was one of the masterminds of October 7th. So, I mean, it's not really for me to say as an American. It's their decisions, but I do think it's an obvious strategic disadvantage and something that they are continually paying for in these wars, with probably additional lives in the future. And so it's gonna keep being a button that terrorists are going to keep pushing because it works for them. Look, in terms of Trump's statement about releasing all of the hostages by Saturday, I think despite messing up Will's potential flight plans, I think this is a good way to deal with a Stone Age, sort of a terrorist group like Hamas. Trump, that has been his method of dealing with a lot of America's enemies in the past, has been to be willing, like he was here, to push for a deal and a ceasefire, but to give very credible threats of in this case, it's not directly the Moab, but to give direct and credible threats of what happens when those deals are manipulated, taken advantage of, and unfulfilled. And I think that's basically what he's doing here. I don't know if we have time in this segment to touch upon the potential, the surprise that Trump announced, a few days ago, that there's the potential for the U.S. to administer Gaza. I don't know what to think about that, quite frankly. I don't really want Gaza as an American, but we'll see. That's a negotiating tactic, or whether we're going to see, the Trump Riviera Hotel on the MAGA Strip, formerly known as Gaza. I just don't know, but it does speak to Trump's ability to, again, just throw out a bad game, a game that has not been working in the Middle East. It's the same mentality that brought the Abraham Accords, right? This sort of endless game about the Israeli and Palestinian conflict holding up other interests in the region. Trump is an out-of-the-box thinker in that regard, and he's not tied in by, sort of the foreign policy blob opinions of decades prior. So, when he says he's going to change the game, oftentimes it works out for him. So I don't know how you could not trust the guy at this point, given how many previously impossible things he seems to have been able to negotiate.
I don't have a ton to add here before Ben closes us out on this topic, but I when I heard that this hostage deal had been made with the ceasefire, I don't know if I said on this podcast, but I remember saying this at the time that, okay, if Hamas holds up its end of the deal, which seems incredibly unlikely because they like to do things like this, they love to break deals, they love to poke the bear and then complain about the consequences. It's sort of their MO. And so it was almost inevitable that Trump was going to have to deal with them trying to play games. And he responded to their game by making it very clear he wasn't going to play. And so they're going to have to decide how they're going to operate now that there's an actual leader in charge who is willing to enact consequences if foreign adversaries and even allies don't do what's in the best interest of America and its allies.
Briefly on hostage for terrorist exchanges, the only answer ultimately is that you have to execute jihadists. Anything else is a suicidal policy which jihadis are going to exploit till the end of time, have exploited. We don't know how many future Sinwars have already been released during this war, with the mitigating factor that the Gaza resettlement plan and potentially, the pushing of jihadists to other countries, maybe it's Turkey, maybe it's elsewhere. The most problematic would be those in Judea and who were released to Judea and Samaria, pending whatever the U.S. administration ultimately pushes for with respect to annexation there. And supposedly a policy there is forthcoming. But setting aside that the jihadis for hostage trades and the fact that I would argue, and there are plenty of religious thinkers out there who would tell you that the notion of basically hostages are worth any cost, as well as including the bodies. There are some who argue that that's a perversion of Jewish law and the tenets of the religion, and obviously a massive debate over that. But I think it's worth emphasizing with respect to the surprise sort of Gaza plan, and obviously we don't know what the details are, but what's been discussed is sort of resettlement of Palestinian Arabs in what is actually Arab Palestine, Jordan, as well as Egypt, which of course used to itself rule over Gaza, and then potentially other Arab or non-Arab countries as well. What Trump has done, if the Abraham Accords didn't do it, this certainly does, is shatter the two-state delusion and exact a cost that the Palestinian Arabs in Gaza who were ceded that land, were given infrastructure, were given billions of dollars in aid, and used it to elect Hamas and erect a literal terror state. And then Palestinian Arabs there colluded with the jihadists on October 7th to inflict the worst attack since the Holocaust. What Trump has done is impose a cost that they understand, and that is actually meaningful and decisive, and which says, you lost a war and you have shown yourselves not only to be ungovernable, but to be unwilling to govern yourselves and to be genocidal maniacs who cannot live side by side with Israel. And that undermines the U.S. national interest at the end of the day because it destabilizes the entire region and causes all sorts of knock-on effects that are bad ultimately for what the U.S. wants, which is not to have to focus on the Middle East at all. And so what the Trump plan does, I think, is it shatters the two-state delusion. The Abraham Accords, working around the quote-unquote Palestinian-Arab conflict that the Blob has forever said is essential to figure out before you can do anything else in the Middle East. The Abraham Accords recognize that was a fallacy. This certainly recognizes it for a fallacy. And we'll see ultimately what U.S. ownership in Gaza looks like, whether that's some kind of stake in and development rights and the like in potential, as they said, sort of Riviera on the Mediterranean. We'll have to see how it all plays out. But imposing a decisive cost and saying that the Palestinian Arabs truly lost a war, as opposed to the endless ceasefires where Israel is never allowed to win, and the Palestinian Arabs are not allowed to lose land when they act in genocidal ways, that paradigm has been fundamentally shifted. And if there was ever a chance for there to be a radical and revolutionary change in the region, resettlement, for the other Arab states who claim to support the Palestinian Arabs to actually put their money where their mouth is and have some skin in the game, this is the opportunity to prove it. So What Trump has done has been dramatic. It's been remarkable. No other U.S. president has even come close to even conceiving of something like this. But in shattering the two-state delusion, I think has done something that will ultimately redound to the benefit of peace. I would argue that this is a Nobel Peace Prize winning move, even though critics of Trump will argue this is ethnic cleansing, which is asinine on many levels, etc. This is a dramatic move that would redound to the benefit of the U.S. nationally. We follow through on it. Let's see if Israel full rats and destroys Hamas now that it is effectively reneged on the ceasefire deal.
And with that, I guess we'll take it to final thoughts and kick it to Amber first.
Yeah, I want to talk about a story that we had come out last night at the Daily Caller, me and our White House correspondent Reagan Reese, going back to the horrific plane crash at the airport about a week and a half ago. We dug through decades of reports through the aviation safety reporting system, which is an online database where pilots can and air traffic controllers can self-report things like near misses, air conflicts, ground conflicts. And we found that there had been at least 30 near misses between airplanes and helicopters over the past 30 or so years, which averages out to about one a year. And that pilots had been complaining about all of the factors that reportedly led to that crash, including the low visibility at night, the amount of traffic at Reagan National Airport, helicopters flying above altitude, shortages among air traffic controllers. And despite all of these complaints, no action had been taken by the FAA to either change the helicopter routes, to reduce the amount of traffic at DCA, et cetera. So it seems, unfortunately, that this was preventable if the authorities had taken care to actually talk to the people who are flying at that airport and listen to their complaints. So I would just urge people to check out that report. It's accident waiting to happen. Feds ignored DC death trap for years, despite dozens of near misses with planes and choppers. It's really insane things that we read in these reports, and hopefully gets us a little bit closer to understanding what.
Yeah, my final thoughts are sort of based on the fact that I just had a number of discussions with Israelis about their judicial reform today, and I learned some things about the Israeli legal system that are insane. We had this whole discussion about the judiciary in the United States intruding on the executive's prerogative, but we all sort of understand that they'll ultimately get struck down by the Supreme Court. Here's something you may not have known. Imagine a world in which the Prime Minister of Israel decides that there's probably going to be a terrorist attack, and orders his chief of staff of the military, effectively the head of the military, to make preparations. The head of the military says, "I don't agree with you. I'm not going to do that." In any other country in the world, you would just be able to instantly fire the head of your military. In Israel, if you fire, any governmental action can be appealed to the Supreme Court and judged on whether or not it is reasonable or unreasonable. I shit you not. The Israeli judicial system is insane. And I watched and listened to an Israeli legal academic, a lefty, try and justify the current legal system and compare it to America. She butchered American law. It was really embarrassing, honestly. But it is one of these things where, I'm a fan of Israel. I'm here. It's a really cool country. Their judicial system is the most bizarre Frankenstein I've ever seen. Effectively, what there is here is they're not even doing law. It is a unelected super legislature that has total control and total veto power over anything the government does on reasonableness grounds. And there's no external constraint. The Knesset, the parliament, tried to redefine what reasonableness is and say you're not, and also actually say you're not allowed to reverse government decisions for being unreasonable. And the Supreme Court decided that they rejected that contention. They said that law has to be struck down because it is not compliant with the Israeli tradition of being a Jewish and democratic state. They could point to no actual binding legal provision that says that. And it really shows that a lot of legal systems are different. But one thing you never want to have is the combination of an unelected Supreme Court and very little democratic input into the selection of the Supreme Court justices, unconstrained by any sort of written constitution, allowed to veto legislative acts on whatever grounds they choose. It's a country that, only by the grace of God, apparently had managed to maintain itself with a rule of law, because the Supreme Court acts is insane. And boy, does the system need reform.
I'll be brief. Just to follow up on that point, there's rumblings out there of evidence suggesting that USAID and American tax dollars can be traced ultimately to those who were protesting against Prime Minister Netanyahu with respect to the judiciary reform policy, which, to Will's point, is really about having a judiciary that is not tyrannical and supreme in a country and able to overrule every other authority there. And of course, a Supreme Court that has typically been left wing in orientation. There's substantial evidence out there, and I think unfolding evidence, and maybe we'll get to the bottom of it with Doge, congressional oversight, and beyond, showing that you can follow US dollars to the activist groups that form the Bibi derangement syndrome addled opposition in Israel, which threatened to take down that government and which contributed, of course, to the ability and the timing whereby Hamas executed October 7th, because they saw Israel as destabilized and on a near civil war footing. So stay tuned for the investigation ultimately that shows you the nexus between US dollars and, of course, Biden administration policy, which during the middle of the war, of course, the Biden administration and Democrats were basically pushing for Netanyahu to be out the door. But well before that, a nexus between US government policy and dollars and the judiciary reform opposition that threatened to topple Netanyahu and made Israel ripe for being attacked by Hamas on October 7th.
My final thought is just to highlight a piece, an essay that I wrote with Christopher Rufo called How Trump Can Make Universities Great Again, that came out in City Journal, and Chris also republished on his Substack, where you can find it. It's basically the agenda that he and I hope for out of the Trump administration with regard to the higher ed sector in this country. And the bottom line is this. Trump has a multitude of hammers, whether that's Title 9, 7, and 6, respectively, under the Civil Rights Act to hit universities, whether that's things like the Clery Act, which I'm not going to go into, but there are just a lot of levers, whether the biggest one, of course, being student loan programs, to basically present universities with a choice. They need to massively reform. They need to live up to the expectations of the American people and be, true institutions of higher learning, of Western civilization, of American citizenship, business acumen, that all those things that they promise that they are, while the federal government shovels money to them, and ultimately are not. They are just woke madrasas, as I've written elsewhere. They really are just activist training camps and have had a huge hand in the ideological takeover of basically every American institution prior to this monumental election in 2024. So once again, that's How Trump Can Make Universities Great Again. It's a piece jointly bylined by me and Christopher Rufo in City Journal. And I really hope that large pieces of this policy will be implemented by the Trump administration, and that we will ultimately, at the end of his 4 years, be on track towards something that was totally unthinkable, I think, before this election and before the last 3 weeks, which is to have a university system that Americans can actually be proud of and actually trust and believe is worth all of the incredible benefits and sacrifices that Americans have made to pour money into these institutions. And I guess with that, that's the end of our show this week. So on behalf of Ben, Amber, and Will, thanks for tuning in. I'm Inez Stepman, and we'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.